the word diet these days has a very negative connotation, but even more so, there's so much noise. There's a lot of noise, like equivalent to a bunch of kindergartners, a bunch of pots and pans banging them around kind of noise. When it comes to different types of diets, you're hearing about every possible new trend of what's going to help you drop pounds in 2025 and what's going to help you look your best by summer and all that stuff. And besides that, there's all sorts of people talking about and parading around about this type of diet is superior for people with diabetes, and this one's the best, and that one's the best. And welcome to the Your Diabetes Insider podcast, where we take all of the mysteries of blood sugar control, focusing on nutrition, exercise, and any of the other 40 plus factors that may impact your blood sugar. If you don't know me, my name is Ben Zeal. I'm a registered dietitian, certified diabetes educator, strength and conditioning coach, and I've lived myself with type 1 diabetes for over 20 years, and I am here to share everything that I have learned in both my personal and professional experience so you can live that incredible diabetes life. So get ready and let's dive right into today's episode. What is going on? Welcome to this episode of the Your Diabetes Insider podcast, where we are going to absolutely just go ham on all sorts of different types of diets today, because it's the time of year where you're hearing about every possible new trend of what's going to help you drop pounds in 2025 and what's going to help you look your best by summer and all that stuff. And besides that, there's all sorts of people talking about and parading around about this type of diet is superior for people with diabetes, and this one's the best, and that one's the best. And there's so much noise. There's a lot of noise, like equivalent to a bunch of kindergartners, a bunch of pots and pans banging them around kind of noise when it comes to different types of diets, different types of ways of eating. I guess we should probably reclassify it as ways of eating, because the word diet these days has a very negative connotation, but even more so, it just has this implication that it's a temporary thing. I'm going to go on a diet, so therefore I'm only going to be on it for X number of weeks or Y number of months, instead of this is a way of life that you want to be able to sustain. So as we dive into things here, my big thing I want you to be doing, and viewing this, listening this with this lens, is this is meant to be, what can I stick to? What can I do for the long term? Because it's cool if you do something for 3 or 4 weeks or 5 or 6 months. It's amazing. It's a really, really big accomplishment, but there's nothing worse. And I don't care what you end up picking. I really don't. At the end of the day, I'll get into it in a second, but I don't care what you end up picking if it works for you. But if you cannot stick to it, if you could not look me in the eye and tell me, I can stick to this way of eating and I know it's great for my blood sugars and I can do this for the next 3 to 5 years without a problem, you probably shouldn't start in the first place. And again, sounds dramatic, but it's the reality of the situation. I have seen so many times with patients that come through our practice, oh, I read about keto, it's so amazing. Oh, I want to do intermittent fasting. Oh, I want to do veganism. Oh, I want to do Whole30 and fill in the blank of whatever, the new poppin' thing is going to be. Paleo, right? Or, oh, I do carnivore. Carnivore is the big rage over the past couple of years. I only want to eat meat and that's it. By all means, again, we've had people that have done every single one of those types of ways of eating that I have just described. Every single one of them has been represented. And there have been people that have been successful and people that have not. And this is going to also help you figure out how to be successful with whatever you end up picking. Because like I said, at the end of the day, you're going for a new lifestyle. You're going for a new way of eating, not to do it for a little bit, but to be able to stick to it for the long haul so you can sustain said results. Because again, if you're someone who's trying to drop pounds and you say, I'm going to go start keto, it's cool to drop 20 pounds. Oh, I've been doing keto. I dropped 20 pounds. This is amazing. And then what? You stop doing what was working so well and you go back to how you were eating before, and then the scale goes back to where it was, and now you're disappointed and you're shocked and, oh my God, I was doing so well. What happened was you stopped doing what was working. It's not rocket science. But anyways, here's the biggest thing, right? And like I said, we've had every type of way of eating represented. We've had every single type of them represented within the last few years, because people hear about things. And the big thing for you, if we jump in, let's go low carb first, because you could almost divide low carb into keto and carnivore. And yes, there are other variations of stuff as well, but keto, right? You've probably heard of keto. Okay, you have to eat a very, very, very low amount of carbs. It was initially developed for kids who had epilepsy, so they're having a lot of seizures, and this was what helped them to not have seizures. And it was basically minimal carbs, 80+% of your calories coming from fat, the rest coming from protein. And For people with diabetes, super natural, instinctive response. Oh, if I go keto, it will be so amazing because there won't be any carbs and I can't spike and there won't be any problems and my numbers will be perfect all the time. And there are people that have that experience, but it's not so cut and dried. And this is coming from somebody, once upon a time, I was keto, I was low carb, and I wouldn't call myself, banging my chest like, oh, I'm a keto zealot. Zeal, look at that. Or zealot, I don't know. You get what I mean. But I wasn't over here saying everybody should be doing low carb, but there was a lot of research that indicated that low carb could be a viable option. So I went with it. And I did it for a long time. It wasn't like something where I'm going to do it for a few weeks. I did it for over 18 months on multiple occasions. I think it was 2 or 3 different times. And it worked. It was great. But what's ironic is I had worse control on keto. And I'm not telling you that you're going to have worse control than me. But a couple things people don't talk about when it comes to keto and diabetes is the fact that you're eating a lot of fat, right? And that fat will induce insulin resistance. So let's just pretend, hypothetically, you're like, okay, I'm going to have a really, really great dinner. It's going to have, I'm making all these numbers up, 62 grams of fat and 6 grams of carbs and 58 grams of protein. That sounds pretty keto-esque. Okay, cool. Well, the issue comes into play where that protein is no longer protected by carbs. So it is going to break down into glucose, which will then raise your blood sugar. You have a pretty large amount of fat there. And especially if you've got some saturated fat in there, then you are looking at a situation where your blood sugar is going to rise from the protein. And then the fat will come in and keep it high. And so what would happen to me all the time was I could get away with being, quote, lazy. I was in grad school. I remember the most notable time. I was in the first year of my PhD when I was doing it at that point. And I could be super lazy. I could basically, I'll dose a little bit here, there, whatever. And I wouldn't go higher than 160. But the problem was I would not come down from 160 or I'd be stuck at 170 and I would not come down. And I'm talking hours because once that fat starts kicking in, it's like a force field. And this is why I emphasize so often, you have to pay attention to the fat if it's a high carb, high fat meal. Well, same thing in this case, because there were no carbs to spare the proteins, the protein broke down. So now I'm looking at, and again, this is my experience, but I'm looking at a situation where I'm stuck at 165. I cannot come down. It's been hours. I'm, going, correct. And it finally mercifully comes down, which is great. But I'm not going to say, oh, the damage is done, but it can be a lot of insulin resistance. Again, depending on the person, depending on what you're eating, etc. And so the thing with keto is in keto land, you can have things outside of protein sources and meat, right? You can have the low carb, high fiber veggies. There are other things, especially these days, it's so popular. There's all sorts of snack options. There's all sorts of manufactured foods and, there's low carb protein bar and other things like that, right? There's all these keto snacks. And I'm not going to say that they're a problem. They make life easier for convenience purposes. But the big thing there is you have the flexibility. You can't have carbs. And can it work for people with diabetes? Yes. If I were to rank it a 1 to 10, 10 being it's the greatest thing since the flush toilet, 1 being it's absolutely terrible, I would give it a solid 6.5. Like it can work, right? It absolutely can work. But the bigger thing here is you are not able to have carbs. Your body adapts to consuming fat as the main energy source, which basically, in a nutshell, imagine that your body right now, let's say you eat carbs, protein, fat, all that stuff, right? You have machinery that breaks each of them down. Now imagine taking the carb machinery, sticking it into the back storage room and letting cobwebs and dust and rust all, happen to it. And then at some point, inevitably, you're like, I really want a cookie, or I really want some pasta, or I really want some carbs. You go have those carbs. What is going to happen? First of all, your body's gonna be like, what is this? And second of all, your carb machinery has been pushed into that back storage room with cobwebs on it, has not been used in a while. So now it has to warm up and it's not going to process the carbs as well. And then your number's going to go higher. But then also, because it's now kicking on, all of your fat burning machinery, it's kind of like, well, we'll slow that down a little bit too. And it's not really sure what's happening. And you now have to readapt to that fat as your main energy source. It might happen a little faster if you've done it for a while. But early on, it's really easy for people to say, oh, I've done it for 10 days and I feel like garbage. I'm just going to have a little bit of carbs. It'll be okay. And you have to do the process all over again. So just getting there in the first place can be a big thing. Now, on the flip side, you have the carnivore side of people where you are protein, no veggies. It's basically keto without the veggies. If we're going to put it really simply, really simply, it's keto without any of the veggies and you're just protein. Go. And it's fine, right? Like I said, I've had people that have done it and it's done wonders for their blood sugar. Absolute wonders. Blood sugars still move, but not as dramatically as they had. And for the same reason as the example that I gave. Now, again, the other caveat is you've cut out the main carb source, well, the carb source. So your numbers aren't going to spike as quickly, which is great. But on the flip side, you still have the insulin resistance possibility. And now from a micronutrient standpoint, sure, you can get them, but there's no, at least in keto land, there were some veggies you could use, and you may have not really done anything outside the occasional strawberry, but you could have micronutrients from veggies. In this world, there's none of that. So you better be finding some sort of source or a multivitamin or something to make sure that you don't end up deficient in any particular area. And beef, one of the most nutrient-dense foods out there. Liver, one of the most nutrient-dense foods that are out there. And liver, I used to jokingly say when I was on the dietitian exam, study time frame, I would literally, if I didn't know the answer to a question, it was like, what food contains this vitamin? I would just put liver, because liver has everything. It seems like everything. I don't really like it. It kind of tastes gross, but again, that's just me. But so you have this end of the spectrum where they work, right? Carnivore, I'd rank below keto because there are really, you have to really try for the micronutrients. And a lot of people aren't paying attention to that because they're so focused on no carbs and so focused on what are the few things that I can have. And neither really leaves room for you to, quote, slip up. And that's the part that is really difficult. And you go look at the research and you go look at the studies, and every time you have a group that's followed for years and years and years, what ends up happening is it's this war of attrition. You have all these people in this group, and let's just say there's 100 of them, just to make it really easy to put round numbers on it. So 100 people in a group, and for the first 6 months, 95% of them are sticking with it. They're good with it. By the end of the year, maybe 85%, maybe 80 of them are still with it. Okay, you're doing pretty good, right? You have some people that fall off. They're going to fall off in any group, whatever. You could be, doing some sort of crazy activity, and someone's going to fall off, right? But then you start going years and years and years. And there was one study, I remember I'm thinking about it, and it was like 3.5 years later, 4 years later, very small percentage were still actually doing it. And so what happened were the other people fell off track. And then because our bodies are programmed at a, internal level to revert back to what we are comfortable with and what we are used to and what we've been programmed for years and years and years, because this other thing is not, it's a new thing. It's not the, oh my God, it's not imprinted like the back of your hand. And what ends up happening is they revert back and their blood sugars go back to where they were. That doesn't solve anything. You didn't really solve anything in that case. And the ones that were able to stick with it, they did great. But again, it's because they stuck with it. It's not necessarily because it was low carb. It's because they stuck with it and they were paying attention to their nutrition. And that, I think, is still one of the biggest components of all these different ways of eating. Intermittent fasting. I personally do it. I personally love it. I do it because it fits my schedule, my life better. But it's not going to inherently do a lot of amazing things for your blood sugar. So if you're not sure what it is, I know I've done a couple episodes about it in the past, but it's basically you have a window where you eat and a window where you don't. So for example, you don't eat for 16 hours most commonly, and then during the 8-hour time frame, let's just say from 12 p.m. to 8 p.m., you eat all your food. And what that does, a lot of people say, oh, I do it for weight loss. Well, yeah, because they end up skipping breakfast, which puts them in a calorie deficit. So obviously they're eating fewer calories. That's how weight loss happens, right? As a calorie deficit. But fundamentally, if you say, hey, I'm just going to squeeze all my calories into a shorter time frame, what it can do from a blood sugar perspective is allow you to have less active insulin for a chunk of the day, which is nice. So less volatility from that. But then because of that, ideally, if you're in range, you're just chilling in range and life is good. That's the biggest thing with it. It's not going to inherently be better for weight loss, just the same way keto, which I didn't mention this either. Keto is not inherently better for weight loss. Anyone that tells you that is full of it. The reason that people succeed on keto is the fat makes them feel full. In this case, you're time restricted, so you might be eating less than you normally would. Not a guarantee though. I personally have a maintenance level of calories on intermittent fasting, and my weight does not change unless I go into a deficit. So keep that in mind. It's not necessarily superior per se, but it can work for some people. It's okay to, quote, break the fast if your blood sugar goes low. And it can be nice to extend out the, quality blood sugar time where it's really, really steady depending on your schedule. But again, some people don't like the idea of having to compress all their calories into a short time frame. I personally do, especially when I'm in a calorie deficit, because I get bigger meals. I prefer a bigger meal to eating, 3 smaller meals. Personal preference. That's just me. Notice a common theme here is personal preference. Can you stick to it? Once your body adjusts to intermittent fasting, I'd say it's pretty straightforward to stick to. Like I can get to 2 o'clock without eating and I'm pretty good. Maybe 2:30. Start to get hungry, but I can usually handle it just fine. The big thing here again is, can you stick with it? I've personally been doing this. And again, I'm not saying what I do is perfect, but I've been doing some form of intermittent fasting for about 6 years and I absolutely love it. And it works for me. But again, it may or may not work well for you. So keep that in mind. The other nice advantage that I will throw out there is when your body is most insulin resistant in the morning, you may not be eating. So I end up missing that time of day, which is not necessarily a bad thing. So that's a couple of them. Then this time of year as well, I want to go plant-based. I want to go vegan. I want to do that. The biggest thing that drives me bananas, and I'm not here to just shit on every single diet that exists, right? I mean, I very well could, but I'm not here to do that. The biggest thing is everybody who says, I'm going to go vegan, it's going to be amazing, I'm going to go plant-based. They look at that and it's totally viable. And there's a lot of benefits to it, but it's not necessarily, it's better than everything else. The same way that keto is not better than everything else. The same way that carnivore is not better than everything else. It may be better for that person. So, and you look at, veganism and plant-based let's go plant-based overall. For people with diabetes, you're obviously, nixing dairy, you're any real, meat source. So your chance of potential micronutrient deficiency, calcium, B12, B6 is going to go up unless you are very consciously adding that back into your diet, which can be a problem because a lot of people aren't paying attention to that. They're so focused on the main event, which is I can't eat these certain things, which is the restriction. Stop focusing on the restriction, focus on what you can have for any of these. But there is some benefit because in some cases, people end up going way, way, way higher carb and way, way, way lower fat, which means, as I mentioned before, fat can induce insulin resistance. So ideally, insulin resistance goes down. So some people find, I ate a ton of plants and I had a ton of, berries and a bunch of veggies and I had some plant-based proteins and guess what happened? My blood sugar did amazing. And now, my ratio is 1 unit for every 32 grams of carbs and it's incredible. And my blood sugar goes up and comes down and I barely even see it. It can work. It absolutely can. Protein has to be something you're paying attention to, however, because you really have to try because you're not thinking about every meal centered with protein. So that's going to be another big component of things. And then fat, just because you're like, I'm going vegan doesn't mean that you're not having any fat either, because avocados, nuts, there's a lot of different things that are still plant-based that are going to have fat and they can and will impact your blood sugar. Now, they usually tend to be lower in saturated fat, which is the real insulin resistance inducer. But again, on the flip side, it still can induce insulin resistance, and a high carb, high fat meal with plant-based is still very viable. And then there's people, like I mentioned, I alluded to, plant-based, vegan, etc. Then you've got the people that don't do any fat and they're just carbs and barely any protein. And we've had people come from that way of eating who have been clinically malnourished because they're literally just eating fruits and vegetables. And you get residual protein from X, Y, and Z. Yes, you do. Technically, you're not going to completely, disintegrate in the next week, but it doesn't usually go well for the long term. And again, with both of these ways of eating, people are fine with it. Some people embrace it and absolutely love it and they feel amazing and their skin clears and everything's great. You go plant-based, there's all these benefits that can potentially happen. Same thing with keto. But the big thing here is, can you stick with that? What if you're just like, I really want, a cheeseburger? You are not able to have it if you're going to do this as your way of life. So again, you have to consider that side of things, is how restrictive do you want to be? And the more extreme you get, the more difficult it is going to be to maintain it for the long term for both your blood sugars as well as for your way of life. It is going to be more difficult. And you have to consider, if you travel, how easy will it be to maintain this? Because again, for someone who's on low carb, can you travel? Absolutely. You go really, really low carb, right? You're like, okay, I'm going to go to, a restaurant. I'm just going to order the protein. And maybe, I'll have some, broccoli alongside of it if you're on the keto side, not on the carnivore side, right? So the possibilities are there. But I think the bigger thing here is, can you stick with, for example, your plant-based, you have a conference for your work. Well, they're catering the food. If there's not a place that's, plant-based or vegan nearby, what are you going to do to make sure that you can sustain it? Or are you going to, quote, break, what you've been doing for a few days for the sake of doing that? Or are you just going to focus on doing it the majority of the time? So there's a lot of different things you have to consider before diving into one of these. And again, you can try to sample and say, I'm going to do this for a few weeks and that for a few weeks. And the other thing, I would take breaks between them, but you can do that and see which one you vibe with the most. But when entering way of eating, you have to remember two things. Number one, like I said, the more restrictive you are on the spectrum, the harder it's going to be to maintain it. But the other thing is, how are you going to find what is best for you? And maybe it is a looser version of one of these. Prime example, maybe you don't want to go all the way keto because that's too much for you, but maybe you want to go lower on the carb spectrum than you have been. Maybe your care team, it would not be us in this case, but maybe your care team said, hey, you need to have 45 to 60 grams of carbs per meal. So you've been eating 180 grams of carbs as long as you can remember. Maybe you find that your body does better at 100. That is okay, right? That's, again, something my team and I would never be suggesting because we're trying to find what's personally best for you and not just a blanket statement. But digressing, right? Maybe you find it's 100. Maybe you try stepping down your carbs a little and seeing how you feel physically, mentally, emotionally, brain fog or not, how you do with your workouts, how sustainable it is. And you kind of start to work within that spectrum and say, okay, this is what works for me. Maybe you just say, hey, I want to go plant-based the majority of the week. Or, hey, I want to go plant-based for these meals each day, knowing that I still can get the nutrients that I need from meat or, at one meal per day or whatever it is. Find that balance of what is going to work for you in your life. Maybe you're plant-based for only certain meals because it helps with your blood sugar more. Maybe you feel better, you feel clearer for certain parts of the day. You can pretty much create your own adventure. It is your life, it is your nutrition, it is your choice of what you want to do. But at the end of the day, I don't care what it is, you have to be able to stick to it and you have to enjoy it. So now you're probably thinking, okay, well, Ben's gone really low carb. He's clearly not low carb. And you look on social media, I'm not low carb anymore. But I've also been very, very high carb on the other end of the spectrum. And where did I ultimately land personally? It depends on the day, LOL. No, I'm kidding. But it really does actually, depending on my workout, etc., and if I'm on a deficit or not. But on a normal day of maintenance for me, I tend to be on the lower moderate carb side. I'm probably averaging about, I could tell you right now, but it wouldn't be reflective because I'm in a deficit, but it would probably be 110 to 160 grams of carbs per day, which isn't astronomical. It's not crazy. It's also not divided up perfectly, 60, 60, 60, 30 or something like, or 60, 60, 30 or whatever, right? It's divided up however it needs to be divided up because what works best for me in my life. So you have to play with it a little bit, but I would not jump to extremes. I would change one variable at a time, scientific method, right? Change one variable at a time. Maybe you're changing dinner. Maybe you're changing breakfast. Even when I went low carb when I was in grad school, right? I'd been really high carb before that. And I remember thinking, I'm going to go back to lower carb. I'm going to see what goes on here. And I went stepwise down and it worked and it was great. But I also didn't feel overwhelmed because I wasn't jumping from 200 grams a day to 20 grams a day. Like that's just not going to end well. So take your time, step your way down. It's going to benefit you. It's going to help. And also, if you're not sure, ask a registered dietitian. You might have one on your care team. If you don't, or you want someone that actually truly cares and is invested in you and gives you the time that you deserve as a patient, my team and I are here to help. We're all dietitians. We all live with type 1 ourselves. We all have exercise backgrounds. We're very, very excited to be able to help you on your diabetes journey, get amazing results. Our average compliant patient ends with a 6.1 A1C, which is amazing. And we might even take your insurance. So we'd be honored to be a part of your journey and grateful as well. So with this, I know I just went on a little bit of a rant about each different way of eating, but let me know your thoughts. Let me know what way of eating you do. Shoot me a message on social media at manofzeel, MANOFTZEEL. Happy to jam on this more, rant on this more, bring on some guests to discuss it more. And if you're loving the podcast, you're listening on Apple, Spotify, wherever, please give us a 5-star review. That would be amazing. It would mean the world to us. Let me know if you've got topic ideas. If you need support, reach out and I'll catch you in the next episode.
Hope you're ready for the next episode. Hey.